51 feet long, crew of 4, no toilet, cruising range of 1,200 miles. And in September 1943, one of these, built of plywood and stamped steel, crawled under the most feared battleship in the world and changed the rest of the war in the North Atlantic. That's the claim. Now here's what it actually took to make it true. The Tirpitz arrived in Norway in January 1942 and almost immediately won the war she was supposed to be fighting. She did it by doing nothing. Commissioned February 25, 1941, she was 251 meters of riveted German steel, displacing 52,600 tons at full load. 8 38-centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets, each barrel capable of throwing a shell 22 miles. A main armor belt 320 millimeters thick, over 12 inches of case-hardened plate running the length of her hull. Turret faces armored to 360 millimeters. Her main deck protected by 100 to 120 millimeters of steel against plunging bombs. A top speed of 30 knots from 3 geared steam turbines producing 163,000 shaft horsepower. A crew of over 2,000 officers and men. Grand Admiral Raeder had proposed stationing her in Norway in November 1941. The logic was economic, not tactical. Position this ship in the fjords, and the Royal Navy can't afford to concentrate its capital ships elsewhere. HMS Duke of York, the battleships of the Home Fleet, substantial escort forces, all permanently anchored to British waters, watching one German ship sitting behind nets in a Norwegian fjord. The Tirpitz as an institution, not a weapon. The most devastating proof came July 1942. Convoy PQ-17, 35 merchant vessels carrying tanks, aircraft and ammunition to the Soviet Union, was dispersed by direct Admiralty order when intelligence reported Tirpitz had sortied from her anchorage. The convoy was told to scatter and proceed independently to Murmansk. Tirpitz turned back almost immediately after leaving the fjord. But the scattered merchantmen were unprotected, and U-boats and Luftwaffe aircraft picked them apart one by one. 24 of 35 isolated transports were sunk. The Soviet Union lost equipment it couldn't replace, all because one ship moved out of a fjord and then came home. Churchill described the strategic calculation directly. The greatest single act to restore the balance of naval power would be the destruction or even crippling of the Tirpitz. No other target is comparable to it. He wasn't being dramatic. Every capital ship held in the North Sea because of Tirpitz was a capital ship not fighting in the Mediterranean, not escorting Atlantic convoys, not doing anything useful in a war that needed ships everywhere simultaneously. So the British tried to kill her. The record of those attempts is worth spending time on, because it explains everything that came later. RAF Bomber Command mounted 4 strikes against Tirpitz between January 29th and April 29th, 1942, while she was based at Vattenfjord near Trondheim. 13 aircraft lost, 0 hits. The first raid, January 30th, launched 9 Halifaxes and 7 Stirlings. Cloud over the target area. Only 1 bomber even sighted the ship. No result. The second raid, March 30th, sent 33 Halifaxes. 4 shot down, 2 more lost on the return. No hits. On the night of April 27th to 28th, 30 Halifaxes and 11 Lancasters attacked. 5 bombers lost. On April 28th to 29th, another 33 aircraft went in. 2 more shot down. Both nights, no damage to the target. The physics of why is straightforward. Tirpitz's main deck armour ran 100 to 120 millimetres thick. Bombs dropped from the altitudes needed to survive anti-aircraft fire couldn't penetrate it. Bombs dropped at lower angles tended to deflect off sloped plates. And the fjord geography compounded every approach problem. Steep mountain walls created constrained attack angles. Kafjord was equipped with smoke generators capable of obscuring the entire anchorage within minutes. And shore batteries covered every credible bombing run. 4 batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns and 7 of light AA positioned on the surrounding ridges. On March 9, 1942, during Tirpitz's brief transit south as part of Operation Sportpalast, HMS Victorious had her clearest opportunity. 12 torpedo bombers launched from the carrier. Tirpitz evaded every torpedo. Her gunners shot down 2 aircraft. The Victorious attack was the closest anyone came to her for the next 18 months. When Tirpitz transferred to Kafjord in the far north of Norway in May 1943, well beyond the practical range of most British bombers, Air Chief Marshal Harris concluded that further heavy bomber attacks were futile. He wasn't wrong. Kafjord sat surrounded by mountains above the 70th parallel. Norwegian resistance agents, including Torstein Råby and Alfred Henningsen, reported the defensive layout in detail. Radar stations on the ridges, fighter cover from nearby airfields, anti-aircraft batteries dug into the mountainsides. Around the ship itself, 2 concentric rings of anti-submarine nets and, closer in, anti-torpedo nets constructed of woven steel capable of stopping a torpedo at 50 knots. Intelligence believed these nets extended 60 feet down from the surface. They actually ran to 120 feet in 3 layers. Surface attack, suicidal. Conventional submarine attack, the approaches were too shallow and too thoroughly netted. Air attack, the armour absorbed the hits, the terrain absorbed the aircraft, and the smokescreen absorbed whatever remained. The Tirpitz sat there, year after year, consuming Royal Navy attention, deranging Allied convoy schedules, costing lives not by shooting, but by existing. The only way through was under. The idea didn't begin with the Tirpitz, and it didn't begin in wartime. Cromwell Hanford Varley, a retired Royal Navy commander, promoted to lieutenant in July 1910, commanding the submarine A-10 from July 1914, had spent years thinking about a specific engineering problem. How do you attack a heavily defended anchorage that a full-size submarine can't enter? Varley's answer was a miniature submarine, designed not for open ocean patrol, but for one precise task: penetrate the defences, place the charge, get out. He has been specifically identified as the originator of the idea of using midget submarines in the Royal Navy. Through his firm, Varley Marine at Hamble, he got the prototype built. Prototype X3 was laid down in 1939. It wasn't commissioned until October 1942, following successful trials off Scotland. A second prototype, X4, came from Portsmouth Dockyard. The 3-year gap between laying down and commissioning tells the institutional story more clearly than any memo could. The Admiralty that favoured proven submarine practice over the outlandish approach typical of the Special Operations Branch needed a great deal of persuading. Admiral Sir Max Horton, as Rear Admiral Submarines, had championed the midget submarine programme throughout. As commander of all home-based submarines from 1940, then later at Western Approaches, Horton kept the concept alive inside an institution that didn't particularly want it. The specific framing, documented from multiple sources, is that the concept had been proposed early in the war, but it wasn't until the Tirpitz appeared in Norwegian waters that any priority was assigned to its development. That sentence contains the institutional critique without needing elaboration. The idea had been right. The Admiralty had needed a crisis to believe it. Before the X-Craft programme became operational, the British tried a detour. In October 1942, Operation Title sent British chariots, two-man human torpedoes based on the Italian Maiale design, hidden inside a Norwegian fishing boat named the Arthur, to attack Tirpitz at her Trondheim anchorage. The crew rode exposed atop their machines, guiding them by hand through the fjord system. A violent storm in the final hours tore the chariots from their mountings beneath the hull. The mission was abandoned. The fishing boat was scuttled. The crew walked 60 miles through winter mountains to neutral Sweden. The chariot was built on a fundamentally different philosophy. The operator was the guidance system, and operator and machine were essentially one exposed unit. The X-Craft was an enclosed, pressurized vessel with a propulsion plant, navigation instruments, an airlock for its diver, and a life support architecture. The crew worked inside it, not on top of it. It was, in every meaningful sense, a submarine, and its doctrine was correspondingly different. Not proximity, precision. The sequence ran: air attacks fail, chariots fail, X-Craft succeed. Each method wasn't just a tactical variation. It represented a different theory of how to solve the problem. The X-Craft represented the theory that finally worked. December 1942, Vickers Armstrong at Barrow-in-Furness received the contract for 6 operational X-Craft, designated X5 through X10. The production brief was explicit. These vessels were built to attack the German capital ships in the Norwegian fjords, not as an improvised response to desperation, as the designed and contracted purpose from the beginning. The 12th Submarine Flotilla was formed. Volunteers were recruited for special and hazardous duty, told nothing about the mission, subjected to rigorous psychological and physical screening, and sent to HMS Vabel, the former Kyle's Hydropathic Hotel at Port Bannatyne on the Isle of Bute. By early 1943, after 18 months of development, training deaths, and mechanical refinement, the program had produced 6 vessels and the men who would operate them. The operation they were preparing for was called Operation Source. To understand what these men were being asked to do, you need to understand what they were being asked to do it inside. The X-class submarine was 51 feet long. Its beam across the hull, without the side cargo charges attached, was 5.5 feet. With the charges mounted on each flank, 8.5 feet across. Displacement, 27 long tons surfaced, 30 tons submerged. The Tirpitz at full load displaced 52,600 tons. The instrument and its target differed in mass by a factor approaching 2,000. The craft was divided into 4 compartments, running bow to stern. Forward, the battery compartment. Lead-acid cells providing power for the electric motor, the pumps, all lighting and navigation instruments. During submerged running, these batteries drained continuously. The charging process, conducted on the surface, produced hydrogen. Oxygen depletion from 4 men breathing in a sealed space was, according to post-operational analysis, the more dangerous atmospheric hazard of the two. Harder to detect, insidious in its effect. Condensation coated every interior surface regardless. Charts became soggy. Navigation was conducted by dead reckoning. Time elapsed, and shaft revolutions counted against a known speed, which required constant mental arithmetic in a space where the arithmetic was all you had. Second compartment. The wet and dry chamber. This was the engineering feature that separated the X-craft categorically from the human torpedo concept. The W&D was a pressure-tight airlock built into the hull midsection. To exit the submarine while submerged, the diver entered the chamber, sealed the inner hatch behind him, and flooded the compartment until the internal pressure equalized with the sea outside. Then he opened the outer hatch and stepped out. A man standing on the casing of a fully submerged vessel, working in freezing water, breathing from his apparatus, holding a hydraulic cable cutter attached to the X-craft by a line. His job was to cut through anti-torpedo nets from the bottom up, beginning at the lowest point and working toward the surface, making the final cut while standing on the bow of his submarine. After extensive practice, the crews could clear a standard net in under 7 minutes. To re-enter, climb back through the outer hatch, seal it, drain the chamber, open the inner hatch. A complete pressure cycle executed underwater in the dark, wearing diving gear in a space roughly the dimensions of a phone box. Third compartment, the control room. From here, the commanding officer could touch any of his 4 crew members without taking a step in any direction. This isn't a metaphor. It's a specific statement about the physical geometry of the space. The compartment contained the helm, the hydroplane controls, the main ballast tank valves, and 2 periscopes. A wide-angle periscope for night surface operations, and a slender telescopic attack periscope for submerged daytime use. It also served as the galley, where crew heated tin cans and boiled water for tea. One participant described the interior as a bit like living inside a railway steam engine's boiler. Nobody could stand fully upright inside. The only place aboard where a man could actually stand erect was directly under the periscope. Aft compartment. Propulsion. Submerged, a 30-horsepower Keith Blackman electric motor driving the single propeller shaft. On the surface, a Gardner 4LK diesel engine. 4 cylinders, 42 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute, converted from a type fitted to London buses. This isn't a detail anyone was embarrassed about. It was a deliberate economy. The Gardner was reliable, compact, and available. Bus engines don't fail at inconvenient moments because buses run on fixed schedules with paying passengers. The same engineering logic applied here in a completely different context. Surface speed 6.5 knots. Submerged 5.5 knots maximum. Surface range at approximately 4.5 knots, approximately 600 nautical miles. Submerged range 80 nautical miles at 2 knots. Test depth 300 feet. The weapons were the defining design choice. Each X-craft carried 2 side cargo charges, crescent-shaped steel containers, one mounted on each flank, contoured to the hull profile. Each charge held 2 tons of Amatol high explosive, 4 tons combined per submarine. The release mechanism was described by Thomas Gallagher in his account of the operation. When a side charge was released, a copper strip between the hull and the charge peeled off, unsealing the buoyancy chamber and allowing enough water to enter to make the charge negatively buoyant. The charge, now heavier than water, sank to the seabed. A variable time fuse, set by hand from inside the craft before release, gave the crew their escape window. The debate about that physics is worth recording. Place later described his preferred alternative. Make the charges positively buoyant so they float upward and attach to the target's hull directly. The explosive engineers rejected this. Their argument was that seabed placement used the tamping effect of the water column and the fjord bottom to concentrate and direct the upward shockwave through the keel. Place remained sceptical. Our outlook was a little doubtful. We'd rather have blown a darn great hole in the thing. He placed his charges as the engineers specified. The engineers were correct. The hull was fitted with electromagnetic field generators to mask the X-craft's magnetic signature against the detection cables and loops the Germans had laid on the fjord floors. Not an afterthought, a designed defensive countermeasure responding to a known threat. 4 men operated this machine. The crew structure was the commanding officer, a first lieutenant handling navigation and watch duty, an ERA, engine room artificer, usually a chief petty officer responsible for all machinery, and a specialist diver. The diver was the last addition to the establishment. It took a training death in May 1943 when Sub-Lieutenant Locke was lost at sea during net-cutting practice for the Admiralty to add a dedicated diver as a 4th crew position rather than expecting other crew members to rotate through the role. The passage crew, 3 men who maintained the X-craft during the long tow to the target, had it worse. They couldn't stand upright except under the periscope. They breathed recycled air in 6-hour cycles between ventilation breaks, during which the submarine surfaced for 15 minutes and then submerged again. They managed dampness, seasickness, and the constant kinetic stress of being towed at depth, the craft corkscrewing 30 to 60 feet in vertical range as the towing submarine adjusted speed or heading. They checked electrical insulation, tested motors, greased machinery, wiped condensation from hull plates and bulkheads, maintained records, cooked meals in the galley-sized control room, slept in snatches, and handed the craft to the operational crew in working order. Warren and Benson described their duty as being like a submarine's diving watch, except that they are continuously on watch for days without a break. Place reflected on what the training hadn't prepared them for. What we never tried, though, really, was the length of tow, which was actually the best part of the mission. It was over 1,000 miles, and the longest took nearly 10 days. So that was our fault. In those small boats, there are so many things that can go wrong. You have an odd valve or two go bad, or be unlucky, and it gets damp inside and you get shivering. It never occurred to us that the tows could part. We didn't discover until afterwards those tow lines weren't tow-tested. That acknowledgement came after the mission. Before it, nobody knew what the tow would actually do to the manila cables. They were about to find out. Loch Cairnborn, Northwest Scotland, September 11th, 1943. At 1600 hours, HMS Truculent slipped her moorings with X6 in tow. HMS Certis followed immediately after with X9. Over the next 2 hours, HMS Thrasher, HMS Sea Nymph and HMS Stubborn departed at intervals with X5, X8 and X7. The following day, September 12th, at 1300 hours, HMS Scepter left last with X10. 6 conventional submarines, each with a midget on the cable behind it, headed northeast into the Norwegian Sea. Rear Admiral Barry had come to Loch Cairnborn to watch them go. He described the crews afterward as behaving like boys on the last day of term. Their confidence, he noted carefully, wasn't the outcome of youthful daredevilry, but was based on the firm conviction, formed during many months of arduous training, that their submarines were capable of doing all that their crews demanded of them. The confidence was real. So was the ignorance of what the tow would actually impose on the equipment. The journey ahead was approximately 1,000 miles to the operational release point off Heroism, Norway. 8 days of towing, then crew transfer at sea, then the independent approach run to Crippled. Each towing submarine paid out around 200 yards of cable. Even so, the midgets rose and fell 60 feet or more in a routine sea state. The passage crews fighting the pitch and roll with nothing to brace against except the hull plates and each other. On the night of September the 20th, Place was aboard X7 on the surface during a ventilation break when HMS Stubborn spotted a drifting mine on a collision course. The towing submarine took evasive action. The wake dragged the mine's mooring wire onto the tow cable, and in seconds the mine slid down the hawser and wedged itself against X7's bow, bouncing with the swell. Place climbed out of the hatch onto the pitching casing in the dark and the spray, untangled the mooring line from the bow cleat, and kicked the mine clear with his boot. He climbed back in and reported the cable intact. They submerged and continued. The first loss happened 4 days earlier. At 09:10 on September 16th, HMS Tirpitz surfaced for a routine ventilation check and found the tow cable had parted. No X9. Tirpitz executed a search of the track for a full day. What they found was an oil slick running parallel to the course the submarine had been steering. Sub-Lieutenant Kieran, Able Seaman Hart and Stoker Hollett, the three-man passage crew of X9, were gone. The likely cause? The manila cable had parted while X9 was already trimmed bow-heavy to counteract the tow's upward pull. When the cable went, the bow-down trim sent the submarine plunging before the crew could correct it. The oil slick was everything that remained. 3 names, an oil slick, and the Scharnhorst suddenly without anyone assigned to attack her. X8 destroyed itself 3 days into the transit. In the early hours of September 15th, the tow parted again. This time, Sea Nymph and X8 eventually found each other, but the starboard side cargo charge had been flooding steadily, and the resulting list made X8 uncontrollable. The passage crew jettisoned the charge, set to safe. It detonated anyway, 1,000 yards astern, the explosive responding to water pressure or detonator fault, regardless of the safe setting. The concussion damaged the port charge, which also began flooding. When that was jettisoned and detonated at a 2-hour delay, the blast caved in portions of X8's internal structure. She could no longer dive. The passage crew climbed into Sea Nymph. X8 was scuttled. The Lutzow mission was cancelled, its weapon having consumed itself. X10 reached the operational area on schedule, but encountered electrical faults during the approach run. A water leak caused a short circuit that took out both the periscope and the gyro compass. Lieutenant Hudspeth, unable to navigate without either instrument in the confined waters of the fjord system, aborted the Scharnhorst attack and spent September 22nd on the bottom. He eventually found his towing submarine again and handed X10 over. She was scuttled on September 23rd on the homeward tow in deteriorating weather. Hudspeth and his crew survived. 6 boats had left Scotland. 3 were gone before the attack began. 1 sunk with its crew, 1 destroyed by its own charges, 1 mechanically defeated. X5, X6 and X7 had reached Crippled. The intelligence on hand suggested that neither the Scharnhorst nor the Lutzow were in their berths. The signal went to all 3 remaining X-craft. All attack the Tirpitz. On the nights of September 20th and 21st, the surviving boats navigated the German minefields at the entrance to Heroism, running surfaced in the short Arctic dark and submerging at depth through the brief daylight hours. Cameron in X6 lay up among the Bratholm Islands on the evening of September 21st. He climbed out on the deck casing in the darkness. In the distance, the lights of the German destroyer base at Leifsbotten, the town of Alta beyond. He brought 4 men 1,200 miles through enemy water in a boat the size of 2 buses. He needed somewhere quiet to spend the night. Not quite quiet enough. A cabin door opened 30 yards away, flooding the water with light and the sound of voices. Cameron, according to his own account, froze on the casing and barely breathed. The door closed. He found a different anchorage, less occupied. He'd written in his diary, at some point during the approach, "I have that just before the battle mother feeling. Wonder how they will bear up under fire for the first time, and how I will behave though not under fire for the first time. I can't help thinking what the feelings of my next of kin will be if I make a hash of the thing." At 01:45 on September 22, 1943, X6 slipped out of its hiding place and began the final 10-mile approach to Kafjord. Cameron was running with a partially flooded periscope. Water leaked into the lens housing from outside the hull, beyond the reach of any repair short of dry docking, which meant stripping the optics down and emptying the tube of seawater after nearly every use. The gyro compass was failing. The automatic helmsman had malfunctioned. He had one instrument of crucial importance. It was flooded, and the most heavily defended anchorage in the European theatre of war lay 10 miles ahead. At approximately 700, both X6 and X7 were working their approach toward the inner Kafjord net defences. The Germans had constructed a boom across the anti-torpedo net perimeter, a gated section that opened to allow surface traffic in and out. Just before 700, the outer boom opened to pass a coaster through. Cameron saw the gap. He dove X6 behind the coaster and slipped through the opening before it closed. Then X6 struck an uncharted submerged rock. The impact was enough to push the bow toward the surface. At 07:07, a German lookout spotted a slight disturbance in the water inside the torpedo nets. The watchlog recorded it as a surfacing porpoise and took no action. In reality, the lookout had just seen the moment X6 hit the rock. At 07:12, X6 surfaced again, briefly. This time, the watch officer classified it correctly: enemy submarine inside the nets. The alarm that sounded next is one of the more consequential navigational errors of the engagement. Instead of the correct number of bell tones signalling submarine attack, the crew rang the alarm for closing watertight hatches and doors. The majority of Tirpitz's 2,000-man crew went to watertight integrity stations. They sealed compartments against flooding. They didn't know what they were sealing those compartments against, because nobody told them there was a submarine inside the nets that had already placed its charges. A lifeboat was launched. It reached X6 as the stricken craft surfaced a final time. Cameron's periscope was useless. His gyro compass was gone. X6 was visible from the deck of the Tirpitz, and close enough that her main guns couldn't depress to engage it. Cameron ordered the scuttling sequence. Documents went over the side or were destroyed. The crew, Cameron, Lieutenant Lorimer, Sub-Lieutenant Kendall and E.R.A. Goddard, were taken alive. The Germans observed that the 4 prisoners were very dejected and concluded they had neutralized the threat. The order was given not to slip the anchors and steam clear, which would have taken at least an hour to prepare anyway, but to make steam in place, as though the immediate danger had passed. Cameron's side cargo charges were already on the seabed beneath the Tirpitz's keel, armed and timing. At 07:40, a second midget was spotted. X7, attempting to extract herself from the anti-torpedo nets after placing her charges. Place had penetrated the defence perimeter and dropped both side cargoes. One positioned beneath the estimated location of the engine room, one beneath turret Caesar, the aft 38-centimetre turret. Releasing the charges and escaping the net system were two different problems. X7 became entangled on the way out. German destroyers Z-27 and Z-30 dropped depth charges. One detonated close enough to damage X7 severely. The submarine struggled free of the net, but was now badly compromised, making perhaps 400 to 500 yards from the Tirpitz, before being stopped again by another net section. Here, the post-war accounts diverge in a way that should be acknowledged directly. Place's testimony and the German operational record give different accounts of how long X7 lay on the bottom in the interval between placing her charges and the detonation. Both sets of testimony agree that X7 was on the bottom for a significant period. The Barrow Submariners Association record, drawing on the operational account, states it was over an hour. The German record, compiled in the immediate aftermath by men watching the clock as an emergency, calibrates best against the confirmed detonation time of 0812. Whatever the precise figure, what neither account disputes is the sequence. Charges placed, submarine entangled, depth charged, damaged, fighting toward the surface while the clock ran down. Place survived the detonation. Sub-Lieutenant Aitken escaped X7 from the fjord bottom and was captured. Lieutenant Whittam and ERA Whitley couldn't escape before their air ran out. They died inside the submarine. X5. Lieutenant Henty Creer, Sub-Lieutenant Nelson, Midshipman Malcolm, ERA Mortiboys surfaced at 0843, spotted approximately 710 yards from the Tirpitz. Whether X5 had managed to place its charges before surfacing or was still trying to approach at that moment, the records don't resolve. The Germans opened fire with destroyers and whatever anti-aircraft batteries remained functional. X5 was hit, depth-charged, and went to the bottom. No wreck recovered, no crew found. Whether 4 additional tons of Amatol had already been placed on the seabed nearby is a question the bottom of Carfjord has kept for 80 years. At 0812 hours on September 22, 1943, 2 massive underwater explosions sounded almost simultaneously beneath the Tirpitz's keel. The battleship was lifted clear of the water. German accounts record the displacement at nearly 3 feet. The entire 52,600-ton mass of her briefly airborne on a compressed column of shock and water. Then she came back down. What happened in the next 15 seconds took years of damage assessment to fully reconstruct. The hull was ripped open, flooding the double bottom of the vessel. Approximately 1,400 tons of freezing fjord water poured in through the breach. Both generator compartments flooded. All but one turbo generator was rendered inoperable. Near total electrical failure followed. Lighting, pumps, fire control, radar. The propeller shafts seized in their bearings. 2 of the 4 38-centimetre gun turrets, the main battery that justified the ship's existence, were lifted from their foundations by the upward shock. Rangefinders were knocked out of alignment, fire control directors dislodged. All radar failed. 2 of Tirpitz's 4 Arado reconnaissance floatplanes were blown overboard and destroyed. She developed a list. Cameron's crew, aboard Tirpitz as prisoners in the minutes before 0812, experienced the detonation from inside the ship they had mined. The design logic of placing the charges on the seabed rather than against the hull, which Place had questioned and the engineers had insisted upon, was now demonstrating its validity. The seabed provided tamping, an inert mass against which the explosion had nowhere to expand except upward, concentrating the shock wave through the one unarmoured section of the target. The belt armour on the sides was 320 millimetres of case-hardened plate. The turret faces were 360 millimetres. The deck was 100 to 120 millimetres thick. But 36 feet below the waterline, under the keel, was unarmoured steel, and that was where the charges had been placed. 4 tons of amatol on the seabed from a 27-ton submarine. Tirpitz's commanding officer had done everything available to him in the time available. He'd ordered the ship swung on her anchors to move her away from the suspected charge positions. He'd sent divers below to find and disarm what had been placed there. They found nothing. The charges were on the seabed, in water too deep, too cold, and too dark to locate by hand. The interval between the first German lookout writing "porpoise" in the watch log and the detonation was barely more than an hour. In that hour, with the crew at the wrong stations, the engines not yet raised to steam, and divers groping along the fjord bottom in the wrong places, there was nothing Tirpitz could do except wait for something she didn't know was coming. On September 25th, with Hitler's personal authorization, the decision was made to repair the battleship in place. No dry dock was available within practical distance. The repair vessel Neumark arrived, along with the generator ships Karl Junge and Watt. German engineering crews worked through the Arctic winter above the 70th parallel, without heavy cranes, without shore facilities, without most of the tools the job properly required. Within 6 months, by March to April 1944, they had restored Tirpitz to a serviceable operational state. It was an extraordinary feat of damage control. But the structural damage to multiple hull frames, compressed by the shock wave, couldn't be corrected without a dry dock. Germany no longer controlled any dry dock capable of taking a ship of this size within the operational theatre. After September 22, 1943, the Tirpitz never conducted another offensive sortie. Her last offensive action had been the Spitsbergen bombardment on September 8th, 14 days before the X-craft arrived. She fired her main guns in anger exactly once in her entire career. After Operation Source, Operation Tungsten in April 1944 found her still at Kafjord and still requiring defence. RAF Lancasters finally settled the matter on November 12, 1944, during Operation Catechism. 29 aircraft from No. 9 and No. 617 squadrons, tall boy bombs, clear weather over Tromsø. 2 direct hits, 1 near miss. Tirpitz capsized within minutes. Between 950 and 1,204 men died. The ship that had paralysed Royal Navy operations across 2 years of war took 11 minutes to sink. Donald Cameron and Basil Place learned they had received the Victoria Cross while sitting in a German prisoner of war camp. The London Gazette citation reads, "Lieutenants Place and Cameron were the commanding officers of 2 of His Majesty's midget submarines, X7 and X6, which on the 22nd of September 1943 carried out a most daring and successful attack on the German battleship Tirpitz, moored in the protected anchorage of Kar Fjord, North Norway." Both men were repatriated in May 1945. Neither had known, during the months of captivity, what the strategic consequences of their work had actually been. They knew they'd placed the charges. They knew the charges had gone off. Cameron's crew had felt the detonation from inside the ship they'd mined, a piece of operational confirmation impossible to misread. But the picture of what the Tirpitz had and hadn't done for the remainder of the war, the convoys she hadn't attacked, the capital ships no longer required to shadow her in home waters, that picture assembled itself without them. Place returned to a navy that told him, with some insensitivity, that he would need to accept a secondary posting, given all he'd missed as a prisoner. He declined submarines. He transferred to the Fleet Air Arm, qualified as a pilot, flew combat operations in Korea, and reached flag rank on January 7, 1968. He served until 1970. For the final years of his service, he was the only serving member of the Royal Navy holding the Victoria Cross. He died in 1994. Cameron never fully recovered his health. The privations of captivity compounded problems he'd carried before the mission. He died in 1962, 17 years after the war ended. X7 was found. The bow and battery section, lost on the fjord floor in 1943, were relocated in 1974 and salvaged in 1976. The wreckage is now at the Imperial War Museum in London. X-24, a later X-craft that conducted attacks on the Laxevorg floating dock at Bergen in 1944, is preserved complete at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport. You can stand next to it. You can look at what 51 feet of functional submarine actually means in 3 dimensions. Most people find it smaller than they expected. The engineering lineage didn't stop with the war. XE-class submarines, improved versions of the X-craft designed for the shallower waters and different targets of the Pacific theatre, were deployed by 1944 to 45. In July 1945, XE-craft attacked the Japanese cruiser Takao in Operation Struggle, placing charges that put her out of action. The post-war Stickleback class of 1954 extended the lineage into the Cold War. Documents released from the Public Record Office later confirmed that the Royal Navy drew up designs for X-craft derivatives capable of delivering nuclear weapons into Soviet harbours. A doctrine of precise underwater delivery traceable in an unbroken institutional line from Cromwell Varley's prototype at Hamble to Cold War planning tables 3 decades later. The concept, championed by Horton and dismissed by the Admiralty until Norway made it necessary, had proven itself so completely on September 22, 1943, that the Navy kept building variations of it for a generation. Return now to Kafjord. Return to the German watchlog. Return to those final minutes before 0812. At 0707, a lookout spotted a slight disturbance in the water inside the torpedo nets and reported it as a surfacing porpoise. At 0712, the same disturbance was reclassified as an enemy submarine, already scuttled, already sinking, its crew being brought aboard as prisoners. The alarm that sounded sent the crew to the wrong stations. The captain ordered the ship swung on its anchors. Divers went into the water to search for charges. They found nothing. The order was given to raise steam rather than immediately slip the moorings. The charges were already there. 4 tons of amatol. 2 clocks ticking on the seabed. Silent. Invisible. Positioned precisely beneath the one part of a 52,600-ton battleship that 13 inches of belt armour and 14 inches of turret facing and 4 inches of deck plate couldn't protect. That is what the X-craft was built to do. Not to fight, not to survive. To deliver a payload to an exact location and then let the payload do the work that no aircraft, no surface vessel, and no conventional submarine could accomplish. The engineering was the weapon. The men were the delivery mechanism. The doctrine, conceived before the war, dismissed until the war made it necessary, proven at 0812 on September 22, 1943, was what outlasted both. Cameron and Place received the Victoria Cross in a German prisoner of war camp. The Tirpitz never fired her guns in anger again. If you want more stories told this way, engineering as history, doctrine as argument, the machine as the protagonist, subscribe. There's more to build.